Welcome to Upside. Jay, I got to start with the question. Why will you not sell me your tweet?
Well, first of all, I did not get a notification of your offer to buy my tweet. You had to send me the direct link.
You didn't get a Twitter notification on that?
No.
Oh, well, that's weird. But you did get the link now. So my question stands. Why will you not sell me your first tweet?
Well, so I tried on my phone and I signed into Sent, and it needed me to approve or activate something in my browser, which it wouldn't let me do on the phone.
Yeah, it doesn't work mobily. Okay, so that's a fair reason. But now that you're sitting at a desktop, sell me your tweet.
Well, here's my question for you, Eric. Why are you trying to buy my tweet?
I don't know. I really don't know. I don't understand this NFT culture, but I feel like maybe there's something here.
NFTs are hot right now. I'm seeing it all over my inbox. Everybody's writing around about it, including Seth Godin. Seth Godin wrote a very long piece this week off of his regular cadence just to talk about how we should walk away from NFTs, which is really something to kind of spawn that type of cultural, like, let's talk about this. And what seems like the span of a couple of months, like it just seems like it really came on strong very suddenly.
Yeah, it definitely sprinted into the zeitgeist here, Jay. And as we do on Upside, we were on the leading edge of the present a couple months back when we spoke with John from SuperRare.
And this is one of my favorite episodes of Upside that we've had in a very long time. I love this conversation with John. Love talking about what the future of digital art could be. And, admittedly knew almost nothing about this whole landscape then, know a little bit more now. And this Seth Godin article kind of got me down the rabbit hole of thinking about or learning about the amount of energy involved in these NFTs. That is wild.
It's the same concept around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as well, right? There's just so much processing power that needs to take place with the backend technology, which is on purpose.
Yes, on purpose. And I had no idea the degree of which there's a piece of artwork. I think it was a Cryptokitties piece of artwork that sold on SuperRare that was linked in Seth's email, saying that the equivalent energy usage was that of an EU resident's electricity consumption for 2.5 weeks. Crazy.
So on the one side, you have energy. On the other side, you just have massive amounts of money being poured into this. We look at right now on Cent, which is a platform that you referenced earlier. Jack's first tweet is going for $2.5 million as of today. That's the current offer for a tweet.
And that's just an offer. Like Jack would have to sign in and say, yes, I'm willing to sell this, right?
Correct.
Super interesting. And Beeple, the visual artist that you probably see on Instagram, he made something like $10 million so far from his artwork through NFTs. One piece of artwork sold for $6.6 million alone on Nifty Gateway. Just wild amounts of money here.
Yeah, it's insane. There's a lot of crazy figures in this space. And what you should know, dear listener, is we knew absolutely none of this was going to happen when we recorded this interview with John. So this is a rewind episode this week to dive back into our conversation about NFTs before Jay and I were NFT aficionados, which we still aren't actually.
This one's a lot of fun. We're excited for you to listen to it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. If you want to own an episode of Upside, maybe you should make us an offer on Cent. We'll consider it, maybe strongly, maybe not. Depends how good your offer is. Just let us know, hello@upside.fm, and we'll get to that episode with John right after this.
This episode is sponsored by Fundboard. Fundboard is a free tool to help you find startup investors and manage your fundraising process. Fundboard helps you to find not just the right firm, but the right person at the right firm. Fundboard makes it easy to search, save, and share. You can search thousands of investors ranked by how they match to your startup. Save them to your Fundboard to create your list of targeted investors. And share your Fundboard with your network to game plan how you will approach investors directly. You can build a tailor-fit list of startup investors in minutes with Fundboard. Learn more at upside.fm/fundboard. That's upside.fm/FUNDBOARD. And the link is in the show notes.
If you can't really speak to art history and there's, just like finance, there's a lot of jargon and things to know. It's not always the most, welcoming ecosystem, or at least, it's not everybody's experience, but that was my experience.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Wall of Art himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going, man?
You're admiring my backdrop.
As I always do.
It's pretty good. I mean, you have a backdrop now. This is your map of the world is definitely better than the bare wall bathroom door that you had for a while, I think.
Yeah, this is definitely a better look. I got a little bookshelf here, which is nice. I have my M25 unicorn.
Oh, wow.
I'm the only person, as I was told by Victor, so this could be, could have been embellishing, but I'm the only person who has not been funded by M25 who has got one of those unicorns. So
how have we not had Victor on the show yet?
I think it's going to be our 3-year thing. We're going to have Victor on the show for our 3-year. It'll be like a big blow.
Building up to... Yeah. All right. Well, I'm jealous of the unicorn. What I got over here, as far as artwork goes, what I have most prominently are 5 custom concert posters for a concert series that I helped put together a couple years ago. I helped pick the bands, pay the bands. We found artists to make unique designs for each of these posters. That was a lot of fun. We've got our What Sucks painting that we both have one of, courtesy of Caroline Zook.
Oh, you can't see mine. It's behind the Peloton, but it's right there.
I know. Just tell me again about the Peloton.
Yeah.
I've got the movie ticket for Test City USA from the premiere. I've got a hand-drawn recreation of the portrait in BoJack Horseman's office that my sister made and printed on canvas for me. And I've got a splatter painting that I made at what we called a Jackson potluck.
Ooh, wow. A Jackson potluck. That's a great name.
The way we did the Jackson potluck was we had white bread and non bread that we put on top of a tarp on the floor. We had things like macaroni and cheese that we put food coloring into. I forget the rest of the food stuff, but it was all colored. And we threw that at the non bread to make like a Jackson Pollock food experience. And then we ate it and it was delicious.
You ate the art.
Yeah, that's why it's a Jackson potluck.
Oh, that's actually really cool. I thought you were just going to waste the art. And I was like, or waste the food, which became the art.
Food was art. We ate the food, but we also had these canvases where we made real art, and that is here in the office.
You know what else I saw that you had that was a little artsy lately? Oh, those custom Creative Elements cookies.
Ooh.
Those were dope.
Those are very good.
Did they taste as good as they looked?
They were very good. I mean, they're sugar cookies. You've had sugar cookies. You could probably tell by the way they looked what they taste like based on your own experience, but they were good. And yeah, my girlfriend Mal surprised me for our anniversary, which I feel bad. I didn't get her an anniversary gift, but it wasn't like a 2-year anniversary. It was a 22 months anniversary.
Oh, that's an important one. Yeah.
I didn't know we were doing gifts. So that's on me. The cookies were great. The artwork was great. Yeah. Art's fun, Eric.
Isn't it cool when we get to support local? I don't know actually when this is coming out, but this might be a little leak. Is this a leak?
This is a leak.
Okay. So we have a little bit of an upside redesign coming down the pipeline here. And we commissioned a local artist as well. And honestly, our local graphic designer, I love supporting independent people. I think you called me after we talked and you said, I love telling independent graphic designers, creative people in general, here's a vision and then just seeing what they do with it.
It's great. It's so fun. And it's just fun to support artists in that way. And speaking of art, Eric, very excited about today's episode. We are speaking with John Crain, the founder and CEO of SuperRare. SuperRare is reinventing art collecting for the digital age. Very simple description, very complicated explanation that I'm excited to get into. But SuperRare was founded in 2017. You might say they're based in San Diego, but it's a distributed team, and they've been bootstrapped up to this point.
Could you imagine your life as an art collector? I feel like that's a very hoity-toity, ooh, I like that term, hoity-toity description of, what do you do? I'm an art collector.
I will probably save this a little bit for the outro, maybe the interview. I went on an art trip a couple years ago, met art collectors, met some artists, met some curators. It was a fascinating, eye-opening, just completely different world than anything I've ever experienced. And it was really interesting to me, but it just felt really, really inaccessible. And with SuperRare, what they're doing with digital artwork, I think is really interesting. And I have a lot of questions. And I don't know how it's all going to work, Eric, but I'm excited to find out.
I can't wait to not get a word in this interview, I'm guessing. This is your style.
That won't happen.
Do you think that when you're thinking about your financial portfolio, how many people do you think have art in it?
Probably the people who are really worrying about wealth. I think a lot of them probably do.
You know who would have a great answer to that question?
Who?
Our friends at Ethos Wealth Management, who are helping you live the one life you have the best way you can. If you want to learn more about Ethos, you can go to upside.fm/ethos.
All right, Eric. Well, let's get into this interview with John Crain of SuperRare. If you, dear listener, have a thought that you want to share with us, you can email us hello@upside.fm or tweet at us, which is preferred, at UpsideFM, and we'll get to that conversation right after this. Hey, listener, have you ever wanted to get a message in front of the Upside audience but weren't sure how to sponsor this show or weren't able to do a long-term sponsorship? Well, now you can just go to upside.fm/classifieds and let our audience know anything that's going on in your world, whether it's an event, an application, a special coupon or deal, or just letting them know who you are, what your company does. All you have to do is go to upside.fm/classifieds and you can place an ad on this show. That's upside.fm/classifieds.
Grew up in San Diego. I did my undergrad in San Francisco, and then I moved out to Brooklyn to work in advertising. While I was in San Francisco, I actually took an econ class that was GE. It was not something I was interested in. I was studying civil engineering at the time, but it was the fall of 2008. And so there was, quite very exciting things happening in financial markets. And I had this super nice, kind of chill older professor, and he came in one day, super pissed off. He was like, "We got to murder the bankers." And it was like, what? That's very extreme. We were talking about supply and demand curves yesterday. To kind of like change the topic. So that was super interesting for me. I'd never really been interested in finance or anything like that. But it kind of, as things were changing, he would kind of like riff on that at the beginning of the class. And so I kind of got interested. And so that's sort of what, when I moved out to New York, I was still kind of interested in economics, got interested in Austrian economics, and then kind of ended up in Bitcoin and crypto.
But you were studying civil engineering and you went into advertising. So help me understand how, that's a lot of different angles.
Yeah, I wasn't actually, the most, I was like, originally I thought maybe I'd do architecture. I kind of liked math, but I also wasn't super focused. I was like, I'll get a degree and do something. And then I realized I was going to have to work in the field of civil engineering and decided that just was not a good personality fit. And so had, an early midlife crisis, decided programming was probably better suited for me. And so I started doing websites and stuff. And that's kind of how I ended up with the advertising job.
Okay, but started doing websites and stuff and then being a self-taught coder, it sounds like. Tell us more about that and how long that took and what that journey looked like. Because if anybody could just start doing websites and stuff and teaching themselves how to code, or people believe that they could, more people would probably do it.
Yeah, I guess. So we had, I had done some coding, in engineering. There's I don't know if you guys are familiar with MATLAB or some of these sort of math coding oriented things. So at the time, kind of was well, I don't want to be a civil engineer. And actually also kind of related to, later on with SuperRare, I was also, into drawing and sketching, and then kind of got interested in processing, which is a generative art coding tool. So I was doing the processing stuff and MATLAB. So actually it wasn't a huge leap. I kind of had the basics down, and just looking at the job market, I was like, well, I don't really want to know what I want to do. Starting businesses sounds kind of cool. I think I'll have more flexibility if I just double down on programming. I wasn't super focused. I was like, this seems like the right general area. I'll just go over there.
Was there any culture shift coming from San Diego, which I picture to be a very chill town, and the West Coast in general, to the Don Draper advertising, Madison Avenue, Manhattan?
There definitely was. I often joke with my wife, she's also from the West Coast, and we met in New York. we sort of felt like we weren't really a good fit for either the West Coast or the East Coast. So we were a little bit too uptight for most people who you might find in San Diego, and then maybe a little bit too laid back as far as folks in New York are concerned. But I was always, as far as like my friends here, I was the guy who was just like doing different things. I was staying in on the weekends, trying to learn to code, and trying to convince people they should let me build their website. So I had a little bit of that hustle and kind of wanted to get out of the very, very chill San Diego lifestyle.
So take us forward from that agency to getting into the world of crypto generally.
So yeah, while I was, working at the ad agency, I was, doing a lot of kind of experimentation and stuff. I was getting more into design and also just exploring lots of different meetups. And one of the ones I found was the New York Bitcoin meetup. Started going to that. It was, early enough before it had gotten it hadn't really blown up. So it was kind of fun. It felt more hackery. So I was kind of like designing wallet software. I had a bunch of different Bitcoin projects that, I love starting new projects. So I was just like, I'm going to build a wallet. I'm going to build an asset tracker. So I was kind of like tinkering and experimenting the whole time.
Real quick, what year-ish was that? And how is that contextualized with the world becoming a little bit more familiar with Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think it was like maybe 2014, 2013 or so. It was like right before one of the big runs. Unfortunately, didn't really have any money at the time, so it wasn't terribly exciting for me. I was still just making software. Yeah, it was it was exciting to see, and kind of like I was getting more interested in business and finance. So I was kind of like thinking about like, okay, that was sort of like the early seeds for SuperRare. I was thinking about like, okay, we're going to have some kind of programmable money. A lot of these consumer apps, I feel like the business models are a little archaic. They're just like selling ads. So it's basically the same business model you had with the newspaper online. And so I was just starting to mull that over. Like what does the consumer internet look like when you can experiment and play with business models?
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. So you were getting into Bitcoin, designing wallet software. Keep going with the story.
Yeah, designing wallet software. I also took a detour. I worked at a sort of like a eyewear, like a Warby Parker competitor called Eponym. So it was kind of like Warby Parker as a service. So I was there for about a year, and still crypto is kind of like the side project. And then I started hearing about Ethereum. I was pretty skeptical. I was sort of like more of like a Bitcoin counterparty maximalist person. And then when they actually launched the network and it was working, and I was like playing around with some of the Solidity stuff, sort of like, had to eat my ego. I was like, all right, this is actually pretty cool. I think I want to get involved with this. And so that's when I decided to leave the eyewear startup, and I went and worked with Consensus out in Bushwick.
For our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum, what was so cool about Ethereum that you were forced to eat your ego?
So yeah, Bitcoin kind of pioneered this concept of the blockchain. So you have like a secure sort of record of things that happened, but it's pretty simple. So it's just tracking. It does one thing really well. So like as like a sort of like a money tool, it's great. Internet money. It's got that use case totally locked down. A lot of people don't actually know there's like a really simple scripting language. So you can do maybe like 12 or 13 things. There's like a couple of different things. So you can write tiny Bitcoin scripts. And what Ethereum did is they kind of took that idea of like writing a script for money, and they tried to abstract it even further. So basically they invented like Solidity, which is JavaScript for money. So you can sort of do arbitrary things, which is, that's where you can run wild and get creative. So and they call them smart contracts, which they're actually not very smart. They're pretty dumb. But you can basically, kind of store a script in the blockchain and then send money to it. And so it can sort of do arbitrary things, which I just found fascinating. You now have kind of like programmable money, more or less.
Can you get even more concrete with like an example of what somebody's doing with Ethereum in this arbitrary way, as you're putting it?
Yeah, sure. I'll plug SuperRare and give an example of one of the things that we do. So SuperRare, it's a marketplace for digital art. And one thing that's, people have kind of talked about for a long time, but have been sort of hard to implement in practice is royalties for living artists when their art resells and appreciates. They might sell a piece of art a couple years later, maybe a collector sells it at a 10x premium to what they bought it for. And there's actually some laws that have been written in Europe around like you're supposed to pay royalties, but there's easy ways to get around them. The deal happened in Malta, so the law doesn't apply. And so one thing we did is just anytime a piece of art resells in the marketplace, we can pay a 10% royalty to the artist kind of in real time. So as somebody buys it, you can easily divert funds to the creator of that artwork. And it's like 2 lines of code. It's super easy. It's literally like, if this is not the first time a piece of art's selling, send X% back to the artist. And it's super simple. It's like this much code. And that's just one kind of small example. So it's just like something that, if you try to do that with kind of a more legacy banking system, might be pretty difficult. And this is just now, the technology it's basically trivial to do things like that. So that was just exciting.
How did you come to this concept for SuperRare? In your story, we left off at you becoming a product engineer at Consensus. At some point, you had this idea and you started acting on it. So can you talk to us about the birth of SuperRare?
I mentioned in college, I had kind of started experimenting. I was never considered myself an artist, but I was an avid, doodler and was playing around with processing, which is this sort of programming language to make generative art. And, had been wondering like this, this is cool. I have friends that run galleries. They still mostly sell like canvases and stuff. Like, what would it look like? Could you collect a piece of, processing art? Does that mean like giving you access to my GitHub repo, or like, what does this even look like? And so that was kind of just like in the back of my mind. And then fast forward to working with Ethereum, thinking more about like, okay, I think we can build new interesting business models for consumer applications, experimenting with that. And then I kind of saw there were a couple things, like a project called CryptoPunks launched in the summer 2017, which was a generative art project on Ethereum. And you could there's these 10,000 different, they were generated punks. You could, own a specific one that had specific properties. So like, sort of like a collectible piece of art. I thought that was fascinating. And then with Cryptokitties, they kind of took that concept and built a standard around it. And that was super interesting to me, just based on what had happened with, I don't know if listeners are going to be familiar with the ICO boom, but there was, crazy speculation. People were buying these tokens. Some of them worked out, lots didn't. But the reason the boom was possible is because they took the time to build a standard. So any wallet could interact with it, or any exchange. It was really simple to build a piece of software that interacted with that token. And so that's kind of what CryptoKitties did with these sort of like unique specific tokens. So they call them non-fungible tokens, which is like a complicated way of saying, this is the thing that has an ID and I can track everything that happens to this thing. And so that was kind of like an aha moment for me. I was like, oh, this is going to be amazing for digital art. You now have a really simple standard, which, I think a lot of great things, especially native digital ones, start with simple standards. And so you have this simple standard. So anybody can issue this thing, and it can kind of represent, whatever you want. You maybe think about it like a CD-ROM. So like CD-ROMs are useful tools, but they get really exciting when you put interesting content on top of them. And so that's kind of like what the NFT is. It's this simple thing, and you can tie really interesting stuff to it. And so I was like, oh, wow, this could be a very powerful tool to build a digital art market, because there hasn't really, sort of to date, the contemporary art market has still mostly been kind of canvas and sculpture, and digital art's like a small subset of that. But even though lots of, really groundbreaking, interesting art that's being created today is itself like natively digital. So it's like, think about somebody making a sculpture with tilt brush. Say, if you wanted to be a patron, what would you buy?
I just wanted to repeat something back because Eric's a lot more in the know on all things crypto than I am. And so I'm here advocating for the listener who isn't as familiar with this stuff. It sounds to me, actually, let me start with this. You've mentioned Cryptokitties a couple times, which I remember seeing a couple headlines from because I think Andreessen Horowitz invested in them and it was a big deal. Can you tell us what Cryptokitties was that created this standard?
Sure. Cryptokitties was a game. Basically, you could think about it like Tamagotchis. Remember, you had these little like digital pets that you could have. So you kind of had this, Tamagotchi. It's a CryptoKitty, and if you had two of these CryptoKitties, they could breed and generate a third one. And so it's this, kind of like cat breeding game. Certain ones were, more exclusive and rare than other ones. So they were kind of like basic, boring kitties. But you had some probability that you could get, they call them fancy cats. And so maybe it's like a cat with like purple hair. And this one's super valuable because you can breed it with any other cat. Now you're going to make new purple haired cats. Obviously very fun. The cats are adorable, like super fun game. The reason it blew up is it was just like very fun to do. But sort of the interesting, kind of like the pioneering technical work was like underneath that, each cat was uniquely tracked on the blockchain. And so you could see everybody who had ever owned it. So as if a famous person owned cat number 100, everybody else who's into CryptoKitties could easily go check like, oh, yep, that's true. Kanye West owns cat number 100. And so then you can think about like, well, in addition to the fact that, this cat's purple, somebody famous owned it. And so now there's like this interesting story around it. So it can be more valuable than some of the other ones.
Do people still own CryptoKitties?
They do. Yeah. I think it's not, quite as huge as it was when it really took off. But yeah, it's still active and going.
At what point do people no longer, like, will the network ever shut down? Can it ever shut down?
So I think Dapper Labs is the company that owns the IP and does the hosting for CryptoKitties. So I guess they could shut down. But to sort of like have the CryptoKitty tokens, like the digital representations go away, you'd basically have to shut down Ethereum. So long as that doesn't happen, the cats will be there.
Okay, so this helped me really circle around here. So because of CryptoKitties and because they made this standard where you could have these unique trackable codes, that laid the groundwork for SuperRare. You're applying that to artwork and specifically digital artwork.
Yep, that's correct.
The art world, especially the art collectible world, strikes me as like very old school. So how did you get involved in art, first of all? And second of all, has this been a difficult marriage of concepts between like an old school industry with a very new technological standard?
Yeah, very good question. So how did I get involved? Myself as a doodler, I was like kind of like passion for art, always loved going to museums and things like that. But at the same time was also, it didn't feel the art world didn't feel super approachable for me personally. I had friends. I moved to Brooklyn. Some of the people I lived with were part of art collectives. I had a couple of friends who ran galleries. So I was like kind of on the periphery of the art world, which, it's fun. Going to a gallery opening is fun. But, if you can't really speak to art history and there's, just like finance, there's a lot of jargon and things to know. It's not always the most, welcoming ecosystem, or at least it's not everybody's experience, but that was my experience. And I always kind of found that funny because in my mind, art's something fun. Anybody can, maybe it's not art history, but it's, art is something fun anyone can participate in. And so I always just thought it was sort of interesting that it is kind of this very open, fun thing to do, but then like art collecting is really exclusive, even though a lot of the components, like, auctions are fun. I think anybody who's been in an auction or like a raffle or, that's a fun game to play. Most people can have a good time if they go to a museum and just look, even if they don't know art history, they're like, oh, this is beautiful. I can at least appreciate the beauty. And, it's also kind of fun to, feel like you're supporting the arts, like people maybe have never bought a piece of fine art, but maybe they bought a piece of art from their friend just because they want to support the passion of the hobby. And so those sort of individual components are very fun. I think very relatable to everybody. And I always thought it was interesting that their art collecting itself was not very fun or relatable to most people. And so that was kind of like my background in art, wondering about this. And then kind of at the time when we were thinking, I saw what was happening with CryptoKitties, I was like, oh, I think you could build a huge digital art market taking a lot of these components. But if you make sort of like the onboarding and the user experience a lot better, you could open this up to a lot more people, because most of my friends have never considered themselves art collectors, even though they could be if they kind of had the right handholding and onboarding into the process.
We've mentioned this term a few times, and I think you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but I have a dumb question. What is digital art?
That's a great question. So it's just art that's created digitally. So this could be, a doodle on your iPhone. Maybe you're just using a drawing app. Could be using something like Illustrator or Blender even. There's a lot of interesting 3D art, animation art on SuperRare. It's just something that's created in the digital realm. And, there's some interesting philosophical questions, like if you make something in Illustrator and then I print out something on a piece of paper, like what's the original? Because originally I created a digital object and I have a physical copy of it. And so there's some, fun artistic philosophy and debate around what is the piece of art. But it's just art that's created digitally to start with.
I'm looking at the gallery or the market right now on SuperRare, and so much of it is there's like an interactive element to it, which makes sense to me because that adds a level of almost authenticity. Like it'd be difficult to just copy this and be like, this is mine, this digital asset thing, because it's like, well, yours isn't actually moving or changing colors or flashing in this way. I'm thinking still about the physical art world. And I think a lot of people get into that because there's like an element of tangibleness and also status. Like people can see this thing that they own because it's on their wall. What does that world look like for digital art collectors? Do they care about status? Do they care about displaying this? Where do they display this? Like, what's the motive?
Yeah. So if you click on one of the pieces of art in the marketplace, I think this is interesting too. It's less well known, and it's actually our CTO Charlie. He's my younger brother, but he actually worked at a business called ArtNet. I don't know. Are you guys familiar with ArtNet? Yeah. So there's this interesting business around art data, and so if you want to know what was the average price of all the Picassos that were sold last year, it's not actually something you can Google. Gallery, there's no requirement to report any of this information publicly. And so they have these kind of aggregators who have relationships with different galleries who do have this information. If you want to know, like, okay, I'm going to make a big investment in this Picasso. I want to know is it the ballpark appropriate range for this type of art? And what's interesting with this kind of like NFT art that's getting created in like a public way on a blockchain is you have a lot more kind of like free public data about it. So if you go to one of those art pieces, you can scroll down and kind of see the history. And so every interaction gets recorded and is, pretty trivial to go ahead and audit. So you now have this closed ecosystem kind of being opened up, and anyone can go see like, oh, how many pieces of art is this artist creating on average? Or, how often are people buying it? Or, so there's this, like, I think the art data industry isn't very sexy, so no one really talks about it, but it's a huge component of the art market. And so what's interesting here too is you've kind of taken that, it's now open and free. Anybody could start scraping this data, aggregating it. So one component there is if you related to the social status, that was a long tangent around like, why would you want to do this? If you buy the piece of art, you're now forever in the history of that piece of art. So you're cementing your record in history with this specific piece of art. So that's one fun component. And then as far as the display solutions go, I think this is actually a pretty big opportunity. It's a pretty fragmented landscape. So you guys can see I have an iPad behind me. I have a bunch around the house. Those are one of my favorites. You can move them around. They're easy to charge and swap out. But there's also like the Samsung frame. It's a company called Mural. And so there's a lot of work being done. I think, over the past 10 years, just with screens getting so much cheaper, we're going to see a lot more happening around kind of like in-home display and displays specific just for kind of like design for art. We've been doing some experimenting. We're looking at recently, NVIDIA has are you guys familiar with a Raspberry Pi? Sort of like a cheap open source computer. NVIDIA is making a similar one, but they're putting a nice graphics card and like a big heat sink on it. So now you could have like, potentially art that looks, maybe we have a recording of it on the SuperRare website, but once you own it and it's running in the display, now it looks totally different because you have this superpowered graphics card that's kind of designed for the art piece itself. And so I think it's still pretty early days there, but there's a lot of fun. We're having a great time kind of experimenting with the UX and playing around.
This is so fascinating to me. And I have so many questions that I just don't even know how to articulate them. Like thinking about the art world again, there's such a big role in collectors and curators. Like when a collector who is known to be a collector of good art buys something from an up and coming artist, that suddenly places that artist in a new category where all of their artwork is now more valuable. What's the analog in a digital world? I mean, I love what you're saying about the history, because it sounds like you can start to create a reputation for yourself as a digital art collector, and that will place value on these things. But like, what makes a digital piece valuable right now in the absence of like a long-term history where people have just agreed that this is an artist that we find to be valuable?
That's another great question. You seem to only ask great questions, Jay. So yeah, so the story, I think, in my mind, when I think about, like you could debate the philosophy of what is art kind of all day long, but for me personally, it's the narrative and the story. So it's about, who is this artist and like, where were they when they, the idea struck them to create this piece of art? And there's a lot of interesting things there. And so one of the things we've done to kind of help make that information more digestible is we recently launched, I guess like at the beginning of the year, an editorial to kind of help tell that story. So we have, artists, studio tours, or just, maybe a whole piece on a specific piece of art. Like what are the deeper meanings and the layers for that artwork? And that's, that goes a long way, right? It's like, if sort of like the emotional, like where was this artist? Where was their head sit? Like where was their head at while they were creating this piece? It can add so much more meaning. And maybe the piece itself is, visual. I find this interesting for like my own art collecting sort of patterns, which I've just been fascinated to watch. There's certain there's this like type of like horrific like glitch art or like weird AI art that's like, it's not at all like beautiful in the traditional sense. Like it's not soothing to look at, but it's fascinating. And you're like, I just want to own that piece because it's, it's so captivating for me. And like one of the artists, Xcopy, he's this kind of dystopian future glitch artist. And I just, like the message there is super interesting around like, it's kind of like Black Mirror-esque. And if you had it on the screen in your home for too long, like, you might have a seizure. It's not that you want to look at it all the time, but like, I like to look at it occasionally. And so I think that's also interesting too. Like the depth of collector psychology is interesting, and, collecting for decorative purposes, if you want to have something pretty on the wall is kind of different than like, oh, this is historically significant for me, or maybe for art history, or there's a pretty big difference there.
What is the role of the artist's existing audience play in this? Like, do most of the purchases driven on the marketplace right now come from the audience, the artist already having an audience and saying, this is where I'm selling my pieces, and they've already built a history of story and narrative with these people? Or are you guys building your own audience that is saying SuperRare is the modern digital artwork collector? Like, in a way, this is like a digital museum, right? So what does that look like right now?
I'd say the majority of the collectors kind of discover the artist through SuperRare. A lot of, and there's a whole wide range. So, some of the artists have more traditional art backgrounds. They might, have a gallery that they work with and are participating actively in kind of the contemporary art market. And then other folks have been kind of participating in these, just virtual communities of people who appreciate art and have been, making GIFs on Tumblr for 10 years, but never really, there wasn't a clear path to like, oh, I'm going to just go to Art Basel next year and, I'm going to bring my GIFs and, people are going to buy them. So for them, these are people who truly have, they have a craft, they've been developing it for a long time, but maybe never considered those, like they didn't consider the art something that you could, like a piece of fine art that somebody could buy. And so they're not really bringing a collector base, but there is a pretty deep collector base on SuperRare. So it's a great partnership.
What do you get when you own a piece of digital art? And I guess to maybe give you a little bit of where my head's at here, I get that on the blockchain, you are the authorized owner of that piece of art. But I guess I'm comparing it back to the physical world. And if I own a painting, it's hanging in my house. No one else can own that painting. No one else can use that painting. But if I like go to the image address, I can see the things that are currently on the marketplace and I could use that. And maybe that's theft. I don't know. So if I just committed theft, sorry. But I was just curious on like, what's the difference between owning a piece of digital art and not owning but using a piece of digital art?
So I kind of think about the NFT as like a certificate of authenticity. So I think what you're really buying is this certificate of authenticity. So one of the cool things about them, how it's structured in SuperRare, is we don't create these. It's actually the artist who creates this digital object that's like a certificate. And they digitally sign a message. They tell the blockchain like, hey, I'm going to make this piece of art. This is what the art file is. Here's a bunch of other information about it. And so this is sort of like the artist authorized original. So I think about it kind of like, I don't know, maybe a baseball card. It's like you could photocopy a baseball card or a Pokemon card. You could still play the game of Pokemon with completely photocopied versions, but having like, you have one that was signed by either the manufacturer or the artist themselves. And so what you're really buying is the certificate of authenticity, and then it comes with some rights. One of those is you can resell the certificate. So even though you might have a copy of an image, that's not actually where the value is. The value sort of accrues to the certificate that is, something somebody can look at, audit the history of, and say like, oh yes, this is the real one that was created by the artist.
And if I own that certificate of authenticity, do I have like right or recourse to go around the internet and say this can no longer be up there because it's not the original? Or is like, how does that work?
Yeah, so you're just buying a collectible. So like when you buy a piece of art from an artist, like you're not buying any IP or other rights. You're basically just buying this one thing that you can have and kind of enjoy as you'd like, but you have it's not like an IP marketplace where it's like, okay, I see this somewhere else, I can go attack them. That would be kind of still in the realm of the artist who owns all the IP around the piece of art.
In the art collecting world today, it's a bunch of rich people who have like nothing better to spend their money on. In this world, you have to have some level of technical knowledge to even get a wallet with Ethereum in it to make a purchase. And it seems like that old world that I'm talking about isn't going to be quick to adopt that. So who are the customers here? And like, how deep are their pockets? Like, is this really just like let me presume this. I feel like a lot of people made a lot of crypto money during this run up. A lot of people lost a lot of crypto money. Is this a place right now where people who made crypto money are spending some of their crypto money?
Yeah, so it's definitely a place where I'd say 80% of the collector base is people who come from the crypto ecosystem, and then the other 20% is more kind of like cutting edge experimental collectors. So these are people from traditional art who are jumping through all the hoops to get a wallet. They kind of see this as an interesting point in time, and potentially is in our mind this is kind of like fueling this revolution in digital art collecting that hasn't really happened before. And so right now it's mostly about 80% crypto folks, and a lot of what we're building over the next year is going to be kind of like making that a little bit easier, so you don't need to you could use your credit card, kind of swipe instead of already having to have Ether, maybe go through, buy something on Coinbase or however you get it.
I had so many questions just about like how this world works, because it's like such a new, different concept that I haven't even gotten into questions about like how this business works for you. Are you guys focused on like what is the metric that's important to you guys right now? Is it velocity of transactions? Is it the number of items on the marketplace? Like what moves the needle for SuperRare, the company, to get this to be more of a mainstream thing? And is that even what you care about?
I'd say one of our main metrics is just the kind of like average number of collectors. Obviously it's a marketplace business, so volume is important. That affects the bottom line the most. But we kind of view this as 10 years from now, there's going to be a vast number of digital art collectors, and so having the kind of like looking at is that growing, right? Is that growing at a healthy pace? Is super important for us. And then also thinking about both sides of the marketplace. I think that's been one thing for like as a first time marketplace entrepreneur, thinking about supply and demand. You don't want too much on either side, and so we've tried to be really thoughtful in the speed at which we're bringing in new artists to kind of match the growth in collectors. Because it's still it's the market, I'd say, is pretty nascent. It's not huge at this point. We're seeing the trends look great, right? The numbers, we actually just crossed. I think artists have earned just over $1.6 million on SuperRare. So that's pretty. We think that's pretty exciting. Because most of them were people who weren't selling their art before. It's still pretty early days.
How do you think about trying to convert old art world money people and collector people and curator people into the digital space versus trying to reinvent it from like the ground up?
Yeah, I kind of think about it like, I think one thing that's super fascinating is like the shoe market. I sort of think about, and there's people are like now like fractionalizing ownership of, Nikes. And you can sort of think about this as like the shoe is almost this new type of canvas. It's like, it's a piece of art that people really appreciate, has a lot of culture, and it was a ground up thing. And you now have the art world starting to like pay attention and kind of like bless certain, they're like, okay, well, that's actually interesting. We thought you were silly and this was a joke before, but now maybe it's real. And I think that's how this is playing out, is artists are getting really excited. They're doing a lot of experimentation, and ultimately, and so they're building a new collector base. And we're starting to see some people from the more traditional art world kind of take notice and say, okay, I thought maybe this was a joke, but there's actually a lot of beautiful, interesting art being created. And so it's going to be a new kind of collector base, but eventually, I kind of think about, like Bitcoin with bankers also, right? It's like, first it was crazy cypherpunks out on the fringe, and slowly it was more mainstream. And now, you have the chairman of the Fed saying Bitcoin's a store of value. And you're like, what?
What about the role that SuperRare plays? Like ultimately, you're talking about supply and demand. You control what supply is accepted onto the platform. So how do you think about your role in determining like what is art that's even valuable enough to be on the platform? That feels like a heavy responsibility.
It is. It's somewhat controversial. There's lots of, you can hang out in the Discord. There's always lots of discussion around this. And so we, kind of early on, we made the decision to, we sort of felt like there were two paths. We could really heavily curate to start or have it be totally open. We decided to heavily curate just because we didn't want to spend a bunch of time building like tools to prevent spam. And like, if something's totally open, it's like, who knows what's going to be up there. So we've kind of continued to be pretty heavily curated. We have a curation team who doesn't include me anymore. So we brought on Anne Wrong, who's kind of like our head curator right now. And, we try to be pretty open, but at the same time, be mindful of like, do we think this is going to be a good fit? Is the artist going to have a good experience when they join? There's sort of like, is it a personality fit? Almost, it's still a pretty tight knit community. And so, it's like, is this person, they are who they say they are. So, we have a pretty long vetting process. We view the artists as partners. We try to get to know them, have, video calls kind of like this with them. And so, but yeah, it's very challenging. And, I don't know if you guys are familiar with fair use as a concept. And for listeners who aren't in art, it's, sort of like if you took a picture or something and you own the IP for the picture, and then like, I put a red dot in the middle, I might be able to claim this is, a commentary on communism, and it's actually my art, and I can go sell it to somebody, and you have no claim over me because I'm making kind of artistic commentary. So it's very gray area as far as like, there's a lot of interesting things there. And so, we kind of try to be careful and let people know like, hey, this is a small ecosystem. I think social commentary and fair use is really interesting, but also we'd love to not, get sued out of existence while we're small. So yeah, you do kind of have to be thoughtful about, who's coming on.
How do you think about your transaction fees and pricing on the platform? Jay's talked a lot about the kind of historical art world, and there's just massive transaction costs there. And when I think about crypto, I think there was this promise of very low transaction costs, but then you had Coinbase charging 6+% on every transaction to get people in and out. So how do you think about what a fair transaction price is?
Yeah. So right now, there's kind of like a 2-tiered component. There's like the primary market, which is the first time an artist sells a piece of art. And then the secondary market, which would be collector to collector. And in the kind of like the contemporary art world, the fees are super high, right? They can be like 40 to 60% almost, which, maybe the gallerist has like a physical store and they're paying rent, and they're, doing a lot of work to sell the piece. So very high. Right now in SuperRare, we take sort of a 15% gallery commission, which my idea of a fair fee is like, we should be able to pay everybody and kind of run the servers. And so that's, based on the current volume, kind of what's fair. I think long term, the idea is volume goes up quite a bit and fees can come down. Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that is where we're headed. Like, volumes are going up, and so eventually fees can come down. And one thing we've been talking about too is it's pretty interesting that you have a platform like Ethereum, and, what does it look like if the community kind of determines the fee structure, right? Like, we have the artist royalty on secondary sales is 10%, which is, that's a big chunk of the sale. We had it at 3%. And then, actually there was a huge discussion within the community, kind of like collectors and artists talking with one another. We sent out a bunch of surveys, did a bunch of interviews, and it turns out people love the patronage aspect. So, a lot of collectors wanted the royalty to be higher. I think eventually we can have a model where it's kind of like determined by the community itself.
Similar point. You guys are incentivized to some degree to have more transactions. And so pricing is a big part of transactions. I'm looking at the marketplace. Some of these things are priced in like the equivalent of millions of dollars right now. And they've been sold before for like $200. So I'm not sure what the decision was for some of these artworks to price that high. Do you feel like you need to play any role in helping the owners price things, quote unquote, appropriately so that there are more sales?
I don't think so. I think, right now the majority of sales happen in the primary market. And a lot of, I think a lot of people put those up just to be kind of ridiculous. It's also like a signal that like, hey, I really value this. Like, don't even try to make me an offer. So on SuperRare, you can kind of make offers at any point that you want. And so there's some, a communication. They're communicating through the price of the art almost.
And even from a marketing standpoint, like I sorted by price highest. And if they want to be at the front of a sort, they can do that by pricing the highest.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of the collectors kind of know you can, there's some stats you can go like sort through and see like, okay, here's how something is trending. So they can kind of get an idea of what a fair price is. But I think ultimately we've seen things sell at numbers. We're like, wow, I didn't think, it was December. The first piece of art sold for $10,000. And the month before the highest piece that it sold was $1,000. And I was like, wow, this, has gone up extremely fast. And so I think the interesting thing about art is like, it is really hard to price, and it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. There's certain pieces in my collection where you just couldn't offer me anything because it has sentimental value. So it's, maybe there would be someone's like, I'll give you $10 million for this, but it's pricing art is pretty interesting.
Do you have any collectors, or have you seen any indications of people financializing the platform, like turning it into a fund, collecting outside fees and coming in and making purchases? Or is that something that hasn't crept in yet?
So it hasn't, it's like the crypto kind of greater crypto community loves, finance and things like this. And so there's been lots of discussion around it. I think nobody's actually done it yet. I think over the next kind of like probably 2 years, we'll see more stuff like that happening. We've seen a couple other people do like fractionalization. So like kind of like selling pieces of an NFT that they bought, which is interesting. I think eventually, we'll see more of that. I don't know. Yeah, I think like our role is more about the art and like, kind of like curating a good experience for reviewing the art. So I don't think that's something that we're going to get heavily involved in, but I think people are, thinking about stuff like that.
Do you think that, this is an off the wall question, do you think that the future of museums are physical museums that are displaying digital art or digital museums?
I think both. One thing that's been interesting, and I think I forgot to mention, we talked about display, is a lot of collectors are building kind of elaborate VR exhibition spaces. And so that's, something we do. We try to do an exhibition every month. It's usually in, there's a browser component. So if you don't have VR, you can still go check it out. But it's also pretty amazing if you do have an Oculus to, check it out that way. I think long-term, the VR viewing experience can just, it's sort of like up to the imagination, right? Like physics doesn't even play a role. So you can build super crazy viewing experiences. But at the same time, having a digital display in a regular museum kind of helps bridge the gap for, people who don't enjoy the experience of like looking into VR. So I think the kind of in-home or like in-museum digital display helps bring the mainstream to virtual art. And then the really interesting kind of like forward-thinking stuff is experiences in like full-on VR that we haven't even really thought of what they are yet.
I feel like so much of this space can be, we haven't even really thought about what it is yet. Who do you look to? Who do you talk with for inspiration and just like thought about creating the future of a industry?
One place I draw, I'm reading Snow Crash right now. Like, I think there's a lot of this sort of like the old sci-fi, I think there's a lot to draw on from there. Also like, a lot of artists do, like, I think the artists themselves are kind of like pushing the boundaries in a lot of ways. Like they're like, oh, what if we did this? Like, what if, I have a piece of art that's based on code, like, can it actually have a viewing experience that's like this? And so they're actually pushing a lot of it forward as well. So I kind of like, part of it is like, well, I'll get out of the way and kind of let the art happen. And that can kind of dictate, the tools that we're going to build.
Well, we're up on time here, John. This has been fascinating. I could have asked a ton more questions just about like reinventing this industry. If people want to learn more about you or SuperRare after the show, where should they go? Yeah,
so if you want to get in touch with me, DMs are open on Twitter. Find me at SuperRare John. If you want to learn more about SuperRare and digital art collecting, you can go to superrare.co. We have a link to the Discord in the footer. And yeah, you should come hang out in the Discord. We're always there having fun talking about art.
All right, Eric, we just spoke with John Crain of SuperRare, and you were right. I took the reins and I asked a lot of questions.
Yeah, I just kind of let you run. Honestly, it was like sitting in someone else's podcast interview.
Which, it's kind of nice. Man, I am so fascinated by this business, and I almost said I love this business. I think I do.
Whoa.
But
don't commit yet.
I love the idea of the business. I don't know how, I have no idea how to predict how successful this will be or not. And if I invested in a business and it wasn't successful, I probably wouldn't love that business. But I love what this company is doing, and I am fascinated by what they're doing.
This is going to sound bad because we just sat through a whole interview with them. And I think logically I understand it, but I don't get it. Maybe that's just me. Maybe like I'm not the person, but like there's something that's like, I'm sure that, like when you told, you ever heard the story about Sarah Blakely when she went out and like tried to get investors for Spanx?
Yeah.
And she pretty much pitched exclusively to like old white men, and they were like, "Well, I don't get it." That's how I feel here. I don't get it.
And I think that's the challenge, because I'm not convinced that this market appeals to your typical art collector, the people who quote unquote historically get it. So if they're trying to capture a different market and expand the market and make this more accessible and kind of build their own idea around what art collecting is, people like you need to get it.
I want to get it. Like, it's not that I'm like standoffish about it. I just, experimental art in general is something that I'm fascinated by, because I don't understand how people value it. How, like, I have some friends like who lived in Brooklyn when I lived in Manhattan, and they would show me stuff and they'd be like, "How sweet is this? Like, this is the coolest thing ever." I'm like, it's just a guy standing in a road. I don't get it. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, like there's inherent value in anything that is scarce if there is demand for it. Right. And that's the difference. I had the same kind of thought when Cryptokitties came out. I was like, I don't care. Why do I care that there's this one kitty that looks like this? Why do I want to collect that? And so the key to all this, I think, is there just has to be a lot of demand for this for the scarcity to matter. And that's the role that curators play in the art world. They are the ones who say, this is valuable, which creates demand in the market for people who are looking for a signal as to what is valuable.
yeah.
And so the question is, like, how much of the traditional art world are we going to recreate in terms of like the value chain or the players involved here to generate excitement and value here? And also outside of that, like the demand in the traditional art world is from people with a lot of means. So that really drives the value and the prices. Now, I've been following SuperRare since this interview. It's been a little bit since we did the interview, and I see what they post, and it's like, this was just collected for several $1,000s. And I was like, what? How and why? I don't get that. I love this. This is beautiful. I would not pay that kind of money for like a digital piece of artwork. But ultimately, like, it just comes down to the story that the purchaser wants to believe or has for themselves about the piece and what it's worth to them. So yeah, I asked him, like, is this appealing to a market where these people made a lot of money in crypto already and they just like have money to spend? And he said kind of a lot of that is. But for this to go more mainstream, I don't know. Like, we've got to really believe in the story and the scarcity and understand why this is valuable and to whom. So that's why, at the beginning I was like, I'm a little hesitant to say that I love this business because I don't quite understand it as a business. But it's so different. It's so unique. It's one of those things that I would want to take a chance on, because it feels like if it hits, it'll hit. And they're in a really good position to be in the center of this universe because they're kind of first movers. But yeah, it feels like you have to really create the market.
Are there other analogs of things that you own and don't show off? Like, when I'm thinking about collectibles and art and all of that, like, you buy a painting and it's in your house, and then you can tell people, hey, look, I have this painting and let me tell you how awesome it is and how awesome I am because of it. Or like, you buy a pair of Jordan 1s and that's better than a pair of Jordan 7s, which are, I don't actually know anything about Jordan, so I have no idea. I'm just assuming 1s are the best. Or you buy like a certain release of a Patek Philippe and it's just like, now I have this watch and I'm going to wear this watch. I'm going to wear these shoes. And maybe you don't. Maybe you just keep them. I'm not sure. But like, is there an analog of things that you buy and don't show others?
I feel like to answer this question, you got to think about status. In the art world, this type of thing, like, you're trying to signal your status or your taste, like, you wouldn't necessarily need to show this off if you knew that the people you caring about your status were looking at the ledger to say, oh, this is owned by this person.
So it's social.
That might be enough for people if they knew that people were looking at who owns this. And it's like, I'm going to show up there. I'm going to build some status or credibility with people that I care about.
To bring that out of a ledger, though, I think he mentioned having these like 3D museums, because you can create a virtual world of all of this artwork and your name as the owner could be on that virtual world as people are walking around.
That's interesting to me because you could build your own reputation as a collector or curator by creating your own digital exhibits and museums and collections. What's also opened up about this is you can have like wildly unique pieces here that create a very different experience. Like we're not just talking about, you have the static visuals. You even have some like 3D visuals and animated visuals, but this is going to expand into like immersive environments and worlds, I'm sure, with AR and VR coming. Like you can have large pieces of art that, maybe you are creating your own digital museum that you charge people to come and see and experience. Like there could probably be business models built out of this too. It's just like, it's so big and so expansive, and that's got to be funded by immediate purchases probably,
Yeah. I'm interested in like future royalty arrangements as well. Because as you were talking, my brain just kind of went into a future state where instead of playing Call of Duty with a controller, I'm playing Call of Duty in a VR environment. Why can't there be art that's posted around there? Why can't like I sell that into future movies that maybe are immersive movies as opposed to how we experience them today? I don't know.
A lot of value is also derived from the artists themselves, and that's just going to take time. That'll take a lot of time. And the thing is, historically, it hasn't really been like any type of meritocracy. Like museums, when they decided what to put into different areas of the museum, basically defined like what is the canon of value in this impressionist style of painting. Like museums basically anointed artists by what they chose to display. And so there's going to be some analog to that now too, but could be, decades. Like frankly, some artists will probably die, and that will make their work more valuable. And that just won't build the type of history that traditional art does for a very long time.
Does it also democratize that taste-making process? Because you could have Jimmy, who's a 12-year-old who just happens to, kind of like with StockX, where you had that kid who was like, he just was really early on the sneaker game, and then he sells curated shoes to all the celebrities and rappers. You could have something like that here, I guess, where you don't have to have credentials to do it. You just have to have taste.
I think yes. And, that's a second step after you build some sort of following for some reason. This can democratize it, but that person's also going to have to build their own following. I think historically, art collectors or tastemakers, they didn't have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers, quote unquote. They had a few dozen of people in power and status and authority who were like, these are the guys. And that's what mattered. I think it's a different model where those people do need to have a lot more status, and with digital connection, like they're going to have way more followers. And I don't know. So all this is like super fascinating to me, and I could talk about it forever, but I have no idea how to value it as business.
Well, when we look at the business model itself, if we can make the assumption that people want to buy and people want to sell and people want to create digital art, then it's a marketplace business, and it's potentially infinitely scalable. So just like looking at Set Scouter, it's a niche marketplace, and we love that business because it makes sense. There's buyers and there's sellers and there's creators. So to me, like from a business standpoint, if the underlying proposition holds that people will demand and will create this stuff going into the future at a increased rate, I love the business model. It's a simple marketplace business model.
And marketplaces are often kind of like winner take all. So if they're first movers, they built the infrastructure and they've like really started to build their name. If I'm an artist, I'm going to sell on SuperRare as opposed to some other marketplace, and that's just going to perpetuate.
You're going to get the highest price on SuperRare as opposed to some other marketplace that's even more niche, even smaller. Makes sense to me.
All right, Eric. Well, what do you want to see from SuperRare in the next 6 to 18 months?
I'd probably want to look at the incremental rate of growth of GMV, so gross merchandise value. How's that increasing both in aggregate? So, going from $0 to $1 million of sold items probably took X amount of time. 1 to 2 takes Y, 2 to 3 takes Z. I want to see those X, Y, and Z shrinking over time, because that means we're going to see more velocity of sales, which is going to talk to me about that increased demand. I also want to see an increase in average merchandise value, because that tells me that there's more bidders coming on the platform. So if GMV is going up and we have 100 items that are sold for $100 each. It's a lot more interesting if the next quarter there's 120 items sold for $110 each, because now we're saying, okay, both of those trends are heading in the right direction.
Those are really smart answers. I'm interested in seeing, like, I want to know more about the different stakeholders in like an eventual digital art universe. Like, are there curators? Like, what are the roles that we should be worrying about, and how are they growing? But honestly, I just want to see more art on their Instagram. Like, I love it. Just keep posting on Instagram. I'm happy.
Yeah, you'll keep sharing it to your story, I'm sure.
You know, Eric, one thing we didn't talk about was John as the founder.
Well, that was a foregone conclusion.
So I love John's background in crypto and blockchain. I think that makes a lot of sense for this business. John doesn't have an art background. Do we care about that?
I don't, because he has an art interest, obviously. I think that, I mean, maybe it would be better if he was deeper into this space, but it sounds like he has friends in the space. Sounds like by being this person, he's probably has the connections now to the space. So it doesn't give me a lot of pause. I do really love that he was kind of in the heart of the Ethereum bubble in Brooklyn. And you know that he's probably flipped through a couple hundred ideas about what to do with Ethereum, and this was the one where he was like, I'm running with this.
Yeah, I think that's probably the more scarce skill set here. If the art background was a problem, that seems like something you could hire for or get an advisor for, and I think it'd be really interesting.
Or get some investors who have connections in the art space.
Well, dear listener, we'd love to hear what you think about this episode. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter at UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on rhyming, find a way and get it done.